5 years later. J.T. Dillon was drunk. Outside, the white-hot desert sun was straight up in the sky, bleaching bones and parching mountains. Saguaro cacti seemed to surf waves of heat, while sagebrush died of sunstroke at their feet. And all over Nogales, people hid in darkened rooms, running ice cubes down their naked chests and cursing God for having saved August's apocalypse for September. But he didn't notice. In the middle of the cool green oasis of his ranch-style home, J.T. Dillon lay sprawled on his back, his right hand cradling the silver-framed picture of a smiling woman and gorgeous little boy. His left hand held an empty tequila bottle. Above him, a fan stirred the air-conditioned breeze through the living room. Below him, a Navajo print rug absorbed his sweat. The room was well-maintained and tastefully decorated with wicker furniture and sturdy yucca soap trees. He stopped noticing such details after his first day of straight tequila. As any Marine knew, true binge drinking was art, and J.T. considered himself to be Tequila Willie's first Michelangelo. Shot number 1 seared away throat lining. Shot number 2 burned away the taste of the first. Half a bottle later, no man worth his salt even winced at the sensation of cheap, raw tequila ripping down his esophagus into his stomach, and sooner or later, out his bowels. By the end of day 1, J.T. had been beyond conscious thought. The ceiling fan had become a prehistoric bird, his wicker sofa a tiger, lying in wait. The toughest, meanest Marine in the world had developed a bad case of the giggles. When he closed his eyes, the world had spun sickeningly, so he'd spent his first night with his eyelids propped open by his fingers, staring at the ceiling hour after hour after hour. Now, on his 4th day of straight tequila, he'd gone beyond thought and surrendered most of his body. His face had gone first. He'd been sitting by his pool, swigging some great Cuervo Gold, and abruptly he'd realized he could no longer feel his nose. He tried to find it with his fingers. No dice. His nose was gone. An hour later, his cheeks disappeared as well. No rasp of whiskers, no sting of sweat. He had no cheeks. Finally, not that long ago, he'd lost his lips. He tried to open them, and they hadn't been there anymore. No lips. It made it damn hard to drink, and he had 24 hours of serious boozing left. He rolled slowly onto his side, discovering he still had his arms and a remnant of a pickled brain. He squeezed his eyes shut, and hazy images clustered behind his eyelids. He'd been a champion swimmer and percussion rifle shooter once. He remembered the welcoming smell of chlorine and the heavy weight of his black walnut rifle. He'd been a Marine with raw talent, lots of potential, before he'd been asked to leave. After the Marines had come the stint as a mercenary, doing work he never told anyone about because then he'd have to kill them. The next image was more hesitant, still raw around the edges, as if it understood that even after 4 days of straight tequila, it had the power to bruise. He was back in the States. Rachel stood beside him. He was a husband. His gaze dropped to the little boy squeezing his hand. He was a father. Now he was a drunk. His manservant Freddie arrived, taking the silver-framed portrait from J.T.'s hands and replacing it in the safe, where it would remain until next September. "How are you doing, sir?" His iguana crawled into the room, its 4-foot tail slithering across the red-tiled floor. The tequila screamed, red alert, Godzilla attacks. The same part of him whispered through parched, rubbery lips, "Glug, go away. I mean it." Glug pointedly ignored him, settling his plump body in a sunbeam that had sneaked through the Venetian blinds and making himself comfortable. J.T. liked Glug. "Water, sir?" Freddie inquired patiently. "What day is it?" "The 13th, sir." "Give me another margarita." In the distance, a phone rang. The sound made J.T. groan, and when the noise had the audacity to repeat itself, he crawled painfully toward his patio to escape. The sun promptly nailed him like a ball-peen hammer. He swayed onto his feet, squinted his eyes from long practice, and oozed straight tequila from his pores. Dry heat They told him when he first moved to Arizona. Sure, it's hot, but it's dry heat. Bullshit. 120 was 120. No sane man lived in these kind of temperatures. He'd spent enough time in jungles pretending he didn't notice the water streaming off his skin or his own pungent odor. He'd learned to block out some of it. He'd simply inhaled the rest. The jungle lived inside him now. Sometimes, if he remembered Virginia plantations and the way his father had sat at the head of the table, clad in his full green beret uniform, his trousers bloused into glossy black Corcoran jump boots, his shirt pressed into razor-sharp creases and ribbons pinned ostentatiously to his chest, the jungle took up its beat in his veins. Then JT would laugh. It was the one valuable lesson he'd learned from his father. Women cry, men laugh. Whiners moan, men laugh. Wimps complain, men laugh. When Marion had called to tell him the colonel was dying of prostate cancer, JT had laughed so damn hard he dropped the phone. Freddie emerged on the porch, austere in his neatly pressed linen suit. "Telephone, sir." "Is it still the 13th? "Yes, sir." "Tell him to go away." Freddie didn't move. "It's Vincent, sir. He's called 4 times already. He claims it's important." JT plopped down on the deck and dangled his fingertips into the pool. He'd dreamed of owning a pool like this for most of his life. He half-hated it. "Sir." "Vincent always thinks it's important." "He refuses to hang up, sir." Freddie placed the phone on the patio. His indignant sniff indicated what he thought of Vincent. JT rolled over on his back. Neither Freddie nor the phone appeared to be willing to go away. Grudgingly, he lifted the receiver. "I'm retired, Vincent." "No kidding, old man." Vincent's booming voice made JT clutch his forehead. "I got a live one for you, Dillon, right up your alley." "It's the 13th. All over half the globe. I don't take calls until the 14th, and I don't take your calls any day. I'm retired." "Dillon, wait till you hear about the money." "I don't need money." "Everyone needs money." "I don't need money. I don't need business. I'm out. Goodbye." Hey, hold on. Come on, JT. Hear me out for old time's sake. Listen, I met this woman. She's really terrific. Good fuck? That's not what I meant. Blonde, probably. You always were a sucker for blondes. JT, buddy, don't be such an ass. I wouldn't have called you about just anyone. I know you're retired, but this woman needs help. I mean, she needs help. Yeah? Grab a phone book, look up St. Jude, dial the number. If anyone answers, let me know. I might try dialing it myself someday. Bye. JT. I don't care. JT hung up the phone. Freddie was still standing there. A bead of sweat traced his upper lip. JT shook his head. What were you so worried about? He chided his manservant. That I'd say yes? That I'd give up all this for a 30-second adrenaline rush? Freddie, I thought we knew each other better than that. I'll bring you another margarita, sir. Yeah, Freddie. We understand each other just fine. JT let his head fall back against the heat-proofed patio. The sun pierced his eyelids until he could see the red veins zigzagging his flesh. Freddie reappeared with a salt-rimmed glass and set it by JT's head. Freddie, JT said. Yes, sir. Let another call come through, and I will fire you. Yes, sir. Even if it's the colonel, Freddie, do you understand? Of course, sir. Good. Freddie pivoted sharply and left. JT didn't bother to watch. He tipped into the pool, fully clothed. He sank all the way down. He didn't fight it. He'd never had to fight water. From the beginning, Marion had been able to do anything on a horse, and JT had been able to do anything underwater. His feet touched bottom. He opened his eyes and surveyed his kingdom. The sides of the pool formed by jutting red stone, the bottom that looked like strewn sapphires. The tickling started in the base of his throat, the instinctive need to breathe. He didn't fight that either. He accepted it, the need, the panic, the fear. Underwater, he could accept anything. Underwater, the world finally made sense to him. He ticked off the seconds in his mind, and the tickling in his throat grew to full-fledged choking. Don't fight it. Don't fight. Ease into the burn. He passed the 2-minute mark. Once he'd been capable of 4, but that wouldn't happen today. 2 minutes, 45 seconds. That was it. He rocketed to the top. He broke water with a furious gasp, swallowing 4 gulps of air at once. His jeans and t-shirt were plastered to his skin. The tom-toms pounded against his head. The memories were still in his mind. Rachel and Teddy, laughing, smiling, screaming, dying. Every year he had his bender. 5 days of remembering what he couldn't stand to forget. 5 days of blackness rolling over him like a fog and choking out the light. After a minute, he began to swim. Then he swam some more. Above him, the air was dry, and the crickets began to sing as the sky turned blood red. "Are you alive?" "What?" J.T. groggily lifted his head. He'd passed out face down on the patio. Something clammy was sticking to his skin. Wet clothes. "Mr. Dillon? Mr. J.T. Dillon?" He squinted his eyes, his pupils refusing to cooperate. Somehow everything seemed red and shadowed and ugly. He tried focusing harder. A human being appeared before him. She had black hair, which reminded him of an Elvis wig. He let his forehead sink back down. "Are you all right?" "That's always been subject to some debate." He didn't bother to look up again. "Lady, I don't buy Avon products or Girl Scout cookies. On the other hand, if you have any Cuervo Gold, I'll take 2 cases. "I'm not the Avon lady." "Tough break." He had to be dying. Not since his first day at West Point had he felt this ill. "Mr. Dillon." "Go away." "I can't." "Stand up, pivot 180 degrees, and don't let the gate hit your ass on the way out." "Mr. Dillon, please, just hear me out." He finally pinned her with a bleary gaze. She sat on the edge of a deck chair, perched like a scrawny dove and framed by the mesquite tree. Young, really bad haircut, even worse dye job. She tried to appear nonchalant, but her white knees were shaking. He groaned. "Lady, you're out of your league." She stood up stiffly and squared her shoulders. Her face was resolute, but the rest of her ruined the impression. Her too-white suit was wrinkled and ill-fitting. She'd lost a lot of weight recently, and the shadows beneath her eyes were too dark to speak of sweet dreams. "Mr. Dillon." "Freddie!" he called out at the top of his lungs. "Freddie!" The woman's lips snapped shut. "He went out," she said after a moment. She began to methodically shred her right thumbnail. "Went out?" He moaned again, then shook his wet hair. Water sprayed out, a few drops hitting her silk suit, but she didn't flinch. He sluiced a hand through his hair, wiping long strands back out of his face, and looked at his unwanted guest one more time. She kept a careful distance, close enough not to show fear, but far enough to be prudent. Her stance was solidly balanced and prepared for action, legs wide apart with one foot back, chest out, arms free. It gave him a sense of déjà vu, as if he should know something about her. But the intuition came and went too fast, and he didn't feel like pursuing it. "Your friend left," she said. "I watched him climb into a sedan and drive away." "Huh." He sat up reluctantly. The world spun, then righted. Considering that his blood had to be 90% tequila by now, his vision was much too clear. How long had he been out? How much alcohol had he sweated from his pores? He was sobering up too fast. He ripped off his t-shirt and dropped it on the deck. Then his fingers went to work on his jeans. "I want to hire you." The woman's voice had gained a slight tremor. He stripped the clinging denim from his legs and tossed the jeans onto the deck. "Better." I'm not sure this is appropriate," she said. J.T. turned on her with a scowl, hands on his hips. Buck naked, he looked her straight in the eye and wondered why the hell she hadn't smartened up enough to disappear by now. "Lady, does this villa look like a convent to you?" This is a private residence, and I'm the beast in charge. Now get the hell out of my sight or do something useful with your mouth." He gave her a sardonic smile, then walked away. Freddie had left him a margarita on the poolside table. It was melted, but he didn't mind. He downed half in a single gulp. "Vincent sent me," the woman whispered behind him. "That son of a bitch," JT drawled without any real emotion. "I'll just have to take him off my Christmas card list." He downed the second half of the margarita. "I'm counting to 5. Be gone before I'm done, or heaven help you." "Won't you please just hear me out?" 1. "I'll pay you." 2. "Vincent did not tell me you were a pig-headed drunk." 3. "I need a professional." He turned, his arms crossed over his bare chest, his expression bland. 4. Her face grew red. Frustration animated her body, bringing up her chin, sparking her eyes. For a moment, she was actually pretty. "I'm not leaving," she yelled. "God damn it, I have no place else to go. If you just stop feeling sorry for yourself long enough to listen." 5. "I won't leave. I can't." "Suit yourself." JT shrugged. He placed the empty margarita glass on the table. Then, naked as the day he was born, all 180 pounds of muscle and sinew, he advanced. Sweat beaded her upper lip. Her eyes took on a dangerous sheen. Her gaze shifted from side to side. She jammed a hand inside her purse. JT pounced, hurtling his full weight upon her. They went down with a thunder, the contents of her purse spilling, a silvery gun skittering across the patio. She bucked like a bronco and attempted to scratch out his eyes with her ragged nails. He slapped her wrist down hard. He lay on top of her, trying to keep her still while protecting the more sensitive parts of his anatomy from her lashing feet. She grabbed a fistful of his hair and yanked. Shit! He jerked his head free, snapped his fingers around her wrist, and slammed it down. She winced, but when she looked at him, her eyes still contained fire. He was bigger than her, stronger than her, and a hell of a lot tougher than her. She wasn't going anywhere, and they both knew it. She made one last futile attempt to jerk free. "Come on," he goaded unkindly. "Try it again. Do you think I'll suddenly change my mind and let you go? Look at me, sweetheart. Vincent didn't do you any favors by giving you my name. I look like the devil, and I am the devil. Genetics decided to play truth in advertising." "I have money," she gasped. "Who cares? $100,000. Oh, honey, that's much too cheap for me. Funny you don't look like the expensive type." He arched a brow at her unexpected barb. She wasn't struggling anymore, so she wasn't totally naive. He took the time to give his uninvited guest a more thorough inspection. This close, he could see that she was truly ragged around the edges. The back of her neck was whiter than the front, as if it had been recently protected by long hair, then ruthlessly exposed by desperate scissors. The roots of her dull black hair appeared blonde. Her fingernails seemed to have spent quality time with a cheese grater. She had the peaked look of the anemic. For Christ's sake, she probably had a large target tattooed on her back. "Little girl, don't you have enough to worry about without picking fights with me?" "Probably," she said gamely, "but I have to start somewhere." She lashed out with her foot. He shifted and stopped the blow in time. Just as he began to grin smugly, she sank her teeth into his forearm. He paled, his neck corded, and pain shot through him, sharp and deep, as her tiny white teeth found a nerve. Rage, primal and ugly, rose up inside him, the need to lash back, the need to return the pain inflicted upon him. He felt the jungle drums in his veins, and suddenly he was hearing his father's boots rapping against the hardwood floors. His grip on her left wrist tightened. She whimpered. "Fuck!" He yanked his arm from her mouth. Blood dewed the dark hairs and made him even angrier. With a heave, he was on his feet, fists clenched, eyes black, anger barely in check. Control, control. He hated men who took it out on women. Control, control. The silver Walter .22 semi-automatic that had been in her purse now lay just 6 inches from his feet. He kicked it into the pool. It wasn't enough. Once he got good and pissed off, nothing was ever enough. "What the hell were you thinking?" he roared. She was still lying on the patio, her skirt hiked up around her thighs and revealing slender legs badly in need of muscle tone. She held her wrist against her chest. It obviously hurt, but she didn't make a sound. He swore again and contemplated leaping into the pool. He needed a drink. "You don't draw down on a Marine," he muttered fiercely. "What kind of idiot draws down on a trained professional?" "You are going to attack me," she whispered at last. She clutched her wrist closer, the harsh red imprint of his hand staining her pale skin. It shamed him. "I was going to carry you out of here." She didn't say anything. He thrust a finger at her. "This is my home. You shouldn't go barging into homes uninvited, unwanted, and... "Untrained?" she supplied. "Exactly." She didn't argue. She merely worked on getting to her feet. She swayed slightly when she stood. She didn't seem to be aware of it, smoothing down her skirt and clutching her jacket shut, as if that would somehow protect her. "I know you don't want me here. Vincent's been trying to call you, and you were never home. And I couldn't afford to wait, so I got your address and I just came here." "Train me," she said abruptly. "Just train me, that's all I want. 1 month of your time. I'll give you $100,000 and you teach me everything you know." "What the hell?" 1 month, that's all I'm asking. You never have to leave the villa. You don't have to do anything other than lounge around and tell me what to do. I'm stronger than I look. I learn fast. I don't whine." "Who are you?" She hesitated. Angela." Angela?" "Uh-huh. Well, just for the sake of argument, why does a happy homemaker like you need training? Angela." I'm being stalked." "Of course. Who?" "Who's what?" "Who is stalking you?" She fell silent. He shook his head. "You don't need a mercenary, you need a shrink." "A man," she whispered. "No kidding." She seemed to debate how much to admit. "My husband. Ex-husband. You know how it goes." She spoke too quickly. She glanced at him to see if he believed her or not. He shook his head again, this time in disgust. "You came all the way here just because of a domestic disturbance? Lady, you track a man like me down, and the least you could do is have half the Medellin cartel after your hide. Jesus Christ, go get a restraining order and leave me alone." She smiled wanly. "Do you really think a piece of paper scares away a monster?" "It beats hiring a professional. What did you do? Run into Vince at a Tupperware party? You're looking at Stay Fresh Seals? He's hawking his connections with retired reprobates?" "We were introduced by a mutual friend who understands that I need real help." "Real help?" He snorted. "You've seen too many Sunday night TV movies. Go to the Nogales police. I'll draw you a map." "The police are the ones who lost him," she said quietly. "Now I'm turning to you." He shook his head. He tried his best to scowl. She remained standing there, somehow dignified in her ugly white suit, somehow regal with her bruised wrist held against her stomach, and for once in his life, JT couldn't think of what to say. The night grew hushed, just the sound of the water lapping against the edge of his pool and the lonely cry of the crickets. The mesquite tree fluttered with the teasing breeze behind her, while white rocks at her feet glittered in the porch light. The night was warm and purple-black, deceptive in its softness. "JT," she whispered, "did you save the orphans in Guatemala?" "What?" His heart began to beat too fast. "Vincent told me about the orphans. Did you do that? Did you really do that?" No, you can't blame that one on me." But his denial was too sharply spoken, and they both knew it. 1 month, she repeated. 1 month of intensive training, self-defense, shooting, evasion, stalking, population control, intelligence gathering, ambushing and counter-ambushing, sniping and counter-sniping, evac and evade, infiltration and penetration, all spec war goodies. Yes. No, you don't get it. Do you think killing machines are made overnight? Do you think Rambo rose up out of the ground? It takes years to learn that kind of focus. It takes decades more to learn not to care, to sight a human being in a scope and pull the trigger as if the target really is nothing but the watermelon you used in practice. Her face paled. She looked ill. Yeah, you're just a lean, mean killing machine. Get out of here, and don't come back. I'll give you me. What? I'll give you my body for the month. Chiquita, you were better off sticking with the money. She smiled, her expression apologetic, resigned, knowing. Before he could stop her, she dropped to her knees. I'll beg, she said, and raised imploring hands. Oh, for God's sake. He crossed the patio and grabbed her shoulders, shaking her as if that would rattle some sense into her head. Please, she said simply. Please. He opened his mouth. He tried to yell, and he tried to snarl. Hell, at this point he'd settle for gnashing his teeth. But the words wouldn't come out. So many years of dirty living, and still he could be thwarted by such a simple thing as the word please. God damn it. It's September 13th and I'm sober. Would someone please get me a drink? She took a step to comply, but then she swayed like a laundry sheet, her knees beginning to buckle. That's it, to bed, he commanded, furious as hell. Just pick a room, any room with a bed, and lie down in it. I have a couple of hours of tequila left, and I don't want to see you again until the 14th, unless you're bringing me a bottle and have a lime in your navel and salt on your breasts. He pointed toward the sliding glass door. Out of my sight. She took an obedient step forward and tottered dangerously. He had no choice. With a muttered oath, he swung her up in his arms. She went rigid, her hands balling as if she would fight him, but her run-down state defeated her before he did. She sank into his arms like a balloon that had just had all the air let out. He could feel her rib cage clearly, as tiny as a bird's. He could smell her, the clear sense of exhaustion and fear, and a warmer, mysterious odor. Then he pinpointed it. Baby powder. She carried the scent of baby powder. He almost dropped her. He didn't want to know. He refused to know. The closest bedroom was neat and tidy, thanks to Freddie. J.T. dumped her unceremoniously onto the double bed. Got any stuff? One bag? Where? The living room? Freddie will bring it in. Car out front? Took a taxi. Used a fake name, Angela? Yes, and I paid cash. He grunted. Not bad. I'm learning, she told him honestly. I'm learning. We'll learn how to sleep. It's as good a skill as any. She nodded, but her brown eyes didn't close. Are you an alcoholic? Sometimes. What are you the other times? A Baptist. Go to sleep. She murmured. I know why you saved the children. Yeah, right. Good night. Because you missed your family. He jolted to a stop in the middle of the room and shuddered. Rachel and Teddy in the golden days of white picket fences and four-door sedans. She was wrong, of course. His family had come after the orphans, and yet her words cut close. You don't know what you're talking about. I have to. She sighed and her eyes drifted shut. My daughter and I need you. You're the only hope we have left. Shit, J.T. said again and made a beeline for the margarita mix. Midnight. In downtown Nogales, some bars were just opening. It wouldn't be uncommon for J.T. to be heading out the door at this hour, dressed in jeans and a chambray shirt, pocket full of money, and hands desperate for a beer. He'd stumble home at 3 or 4, a couple of six-packs beneath his belt, and a woman in his arms. The nights ran together. This was the first time the man could recall a woman sleeping in the guest room with her own suitcase. The first time he knew a woman was in the house, but not in J.T.'s bed. Instead, J.T. was face down in the living room, the iguana keeping him company. The house was still, quiet, almost stagnant, and yet the man knew that everything had changed. After 3 years, the pattern had been broken. His instructions on this point were clear. He crept through the darkened hall. Moonbeams bathed the living room in silvery light. In one corner, a small, yellow glowing heat lamp illuminated the iguana and J.T.'s bare feet. Neither creature stirred. The man turned away and moved carefully down the hall to the study. He picked up the telephone, years of practice making the motion soundless. He dialed from memory, already cupping his hand over his mouth to muffle his voice. "There's a woman," he said the moment the other end picked up. "A woman?" "Vincent sent her." "Damn." A long pause. "Her name?" "Angela, that's all, not her real name." "Obviously. Vital statistics?" "Mid-20s, 5 feet 2 inches, 100 pounds, brown eyes, fair complexion, originally a blonde." "Armed?" "A Walter 22 semi-automatic." "Huh. Child's toy." "ID?" "Nothing." "She must have something." "There was nothing," he insisted. "I checked her suitcase, the lining, hairspray canister, hairbrush, shoe soles, everything. Plenty of cash, but no ID. She has an accent, I can't quite place it. Northern, maybe, Boston." "A professional?" "I don't think so. She doesn't seem to know much." "Given the company JT generally keeps, she's probably an ex-murderer who hacked up her husband and children." "What should I do?" A frustrated sigh. "He's back in business?" "She's here, isn't she?" "Damn him." "Never mind, I'll take care of it. You just hold tight." "All right." "You did the right thing by calling." "Thank you. How is he?" The silence stretched out. "He's dying. He's in a lot of pain. He wants to know why his son isn't here." "Does he ask for me?" "No, but don't worry, he doesn't ask for me either. All he's ever cared about was JT." "Of course." His voice was appropriately apologetic. He'd given his loyalty to a hard man a long time ago. His loyalty had never wavered. Over the years, he'd simply grown accustomed to his place. "I'll call you if anything changes." "You do that." "Good night." "Yeah, good night." He cradled the phone carefully. It didn't matter. The overhead lights snapped on. He turned slowly. JT lounged against the door jamb. His arms were crossed over his bare chest. His eyes were bloodshot, but they were also intent. "Freddie, I believe it's time we talked." Tess Williams awoke as she'd learned to awaken, slowly, degree by degree, so that she reached consciousness without ever giving herself away. First, her ears woke up, seeking out the sound of another person breathing. Next, her skin prickled to life, searching for the burning length of her husband's body pressed against her back. Finally, when her ears registered no sound and her skin found her alone in her bed, her eyes opened. Going automatically to the closet and checking the small wooden chair she'd jammed beneath the doorknob in the middle of the night. The chair was still in place. She released the breath she'd been holding and sat up. The empty room was already bright with mid-morning sun, the adobe walls golden and cheery. The air was hot. Her t-shirt stuck to her back, but maybe the sweat came from nightmares that never quite went away. She'd once liked mornings. They were difficult for her now, but not as difficult as night, when she would lie there and try to force her eyes to give up their vigilant search of shadows in favor of sleep. "You made it," she told herself. "You actually made it." For the last 2 years, she'd been running, clutching her 4-year-old daughter's hand and trying to convince Samantha that everything would be all right. She'd picked up aliases like decorative accessories and new addresses like spare parts, but she'd never really escaped. Late at night, she would sit at the edge of her daughter's bed, stroking Samantha's golden hair, and stare at the closet with fatalistic eyes. She knew what kind of monsters hid in the closet. She had seen the crime scene photos of what they could do. 3 weeks ago, her personal monster had broken out of a maximum security prison by beating 2 guards to death in under 2 minutes. Tess had called Lieutenant Lance Difford. He'd called Vince. The wheels were set in motion. Tess Williams had hidden Samantha safely away. Then she had traveled as far as she could travel. Then she had traveled some more. First, she'd taken the train, and the train had taken her through New England fields of waving grass and industrial sectors of twisted metal. Then she'd caught a plane, flying over everything as if that would help her forget. and covering so many miles. She left behind fall and returned to summer. Landing in Phoenix was like arriving in a moon crater. Everything was red, dusty, and bordered by distant blue mountains. She'd never seen cacti. Here, roads were lined with them. She'd never seen cactus. Here they cover the land like an encroaching army. The bus had only moved her farther into alien terrain. The red hills had disappeared. The sun had gained fury. Signs for cities had been replaced by signs reading, State Prison in Area, Do Not Stop for Hitchhikers. The reds and browns had seeped away until the bus rolled through sun-baked amber and bleached-out greens. The mountains no longer followed like kindly grandfathers. In this strange, harsh land of southern Arizona, even the hills were tormented, methodically flayed alive by mining trucks and bulldozers. It was the kind of land where you really did expect to turn and see the OK Corral, the kind of land where lizards were beautiful and coyotes cute, the kind of land where the hothouse rose died and the prickly cactus lived. It was perfect. Tess climbed out of bed. She moved slowly. Her right leg was stiff and achy, the jagged scar twitching with ghost pains. Her left wrist throbbed, ringed by a harsh circle of purple bruises. She could tell it wasn't anything serious. Her father had taught her a lot about broken bones. As things went in her life these days, a bruised wrist was the least of her concerns. She turned her attention to the bed. She made it without thinking, tucking the corners tightly and smoothing the covers with military precision. "I want to be able to bounce a quarter off that bed, Teresa. Youth is no excuse for sloppiness. You must always seek to improve." She caught herself folding back the edge of the sheet over the light blanket and dug her fingertips into her palms. In a deliberate motion, she ripped off the blanket and dumped it on the floor. "I will not make the bed this morning," she stated to the empty room. "I choose not to make the bed." She wouldn't clean anymore either, or wash dishes or scrub floors. She remembered too well the scent of ammonia as she rubbed down the windows, the doorknobs, the banisters. She'd found the pungent odor friendly, a deep, clean sort of scent. This is my house, and not only does it look clean, but it smells clean. Once, when she'd taken the initiative to rub down the window casings with ammonia, Jim had even complimented her. She'd beamed at him, married 1 year, already 8 months pregnant, and as eager as a lapdog for his sparing praise. Later, Lieutenant Difford had explained to her how ammonia was one of the few substances that rid surfaces of fingerprints. Now she couldn't smell ammonia without feeling ill. Her gaze was drawn back to the bed, the rumpled sheets, the covers tossed and wilted on the floor. For a moment, the impulse, the sheer need to make that bed and make it right, because she had to seek to improve herself, you should always seek to improve, nearly overwhelmed her. Sweat beaded her upper lip. She fisted her hands to keep them from picking up the blankets. "Don't give in. He messed with your mind, Tess, but that's done now. You belong to yourself, and you are tough. You won, damn it. You won." The words didn't soothe her. She crossed to the bureau to retrieve her gun from her purse. Only at the last minute did she remember that the .22 had fallen on the patio. J.T. Dillon had it now. She froze. She had to have her gun. She ate with her gun, slept with her gun, walked with her gun. She couldn't be weaponless, defenseless, vulnerable, weak. Oh, God. Her breathing accelerated, her stomach plummeted, and her head began to spin. She walked the edge of the anxiety attack, feeling the shakes and knowing that she either found solid footing now or plunged into the abyss. Breathe, Tess, breathe. But the friendly desert air kept flirting with her lungs. She bent down and forcefully caught a gulp by her knees, squeezing her eyes shut. "Can I walk you home?" She was startled. "You mean me?" She hugged her schoolbooks more tightly against her Mount Greylock High sweater. She couldn't believe the police officer was addressing her. She was not the sort of girl handsome young men addressed. "No," he teased lightly. "I'm talking to the grass." He pushed himself away from the tree. his smile unfurling to reveal 2 charming dimples. All the girls in her class talked of those dimples, dreamed of those dimples. "You're Teresa Matthews, right?" She nodded stupidly. She should move. She knew she should move. She was already running late for the store, and her father did not tolerate tardiness. She remained standing there, staring at this young man's handsome face. He looked so strong, a man of the law, a man of integrity. For one moment she found herself thinking, if I told you everything, would you save me? Would somebody please save me? "Well, Teresa Matthews, I'm Officer Beckett. Jim Beckett." "I know." Her gaze fell to the grass. "Everyone knows who you are." "May I walk you home, Teresa Matthews? Would you allow me the privilege?" She remained uncertain, too overwhelmed to speak. Her father would kill her. Only promiscuous young women, evil women, enticed men to walk them home. But she didn't want to send Jim Beckett away. She didn't know what to do. He leaned over and winked at her. His blue eyes were so clear, so calm, so steady. "Come on, Teresa, I'm a cop. If you can't trust me, who can you trust?" "I won," she muttered by her knees. "Damn it, I won." But she wanted to cry. She'd won, but the victory remained hollow, the price too high. He'd done things to her that never should have been done. He'd taken things from her that she couldn't afford to lose. Even now he was still in her head. Some day soon he would kill her. He'd promised to cut out her still-beating heart, and Jim always did what he said. She forced her head up. She took a deep breath. She pressed her fists against her thighs hard enough to welt her skin. "Fight, Tess. It's all you have left." She pushed away from the dresser and moved to her suitcase, politely brought to her room by Freddie. She'd made it here, step 1 of her plan. Next, she had to get JT to agree to train her. Dimly, she remembered mentioning her daughter to him. That had been a mistake. Never tell them more than you have to. Never tell the truth if a lie will suffice. Maybe JT wouldn't remember. He hadn't seemed too sober. Vincent should have warned her about his drinking. She didn't know much about JT. Vince had said JT was the kind of man who could do anything he wanted to, but didn't seem to want to do much. He'd been raised in a wealthy, well-connected family in Virginia, attended West Point, but then left for reasons unknown, and joined the Marines. Then he'd left the Marines and struck out solo, rapidly earning a reputation for a fearlessness bordering on insanity. As a mercenary, he'd drifted toward doing the impossible and been indifferent to anything less. He hated politics, loved women. He was fanatical about fulfilling his word and non-committal about everything else. 5 years ago, he'd up and left the mercenary business without explanation. Like the prodigal son, he'd returned to Virginia, and in a sudden flurry of unfathomable activity, he'd married, adopted a child, and settled down in the suburbs as if all along he'd really been a shoe salesman. Later, a 16-year-old with a new Camaro, an even newer license, had killed JT's wife and son in a head-on collision, and JT had disappeared to Arizona. She hadn't expected him to be drinking. She hadn't expected him to still appear so strong. She'd pictured him as being older, maybe soft and overripe around the middle, a man who'd once been in his prime, but now was melting around the edges. Instead, he'd smelled of tequila. His body was toned and hard. He'd moved fast, pinning her without any effort. He had black hair covering his head, his arms, his chest. Jim had had no hair, not on his head, not on his body. He'd been smooth as marble. Like a swimmer, she'd thought, and only later understood the full depth of her naivete. Jim's touch had always been cold and dry, as if he were too perfect for such things as sweat. The first time she'd heard him urinate, she felt a vague sense of surprise. He gave the impression of being above such basic biological functions. Jim had been mannequin perfect. If only she'd held that thought longer. She'd stick with J.T. Dillon. He'd once saved orphans. He'd been married and had a child. He'd destroyed things for money. For her purposes, he would do. And if helping her cost J.T. Dillon too much? She already knew the answer. She'd spent years coming to terms with it.